You should take life seriously by treating it like a video game. Now, I know this concept for a YouTube video isn't entirely original. When I came up with it, I scrolled through and saw endless videos using the same concept to make standard self-help points. But according to my comments, I'm somehow both a ripoff of Jordan Peterson and Synthetic Man at the same time. So what's one more instance of mimicry? Nonetheless, I think I've got some slightly more substantive things to say than most of these videos, so at least there's that. Anyway, I've discussed in previous videos various ways that life is similar to video games, and how using video games as an analogy can help us realize certain truths about real life. And this got me thinking about how that works on a practical level. If video games are little images of reality in many respects, then it is only reasonable to conclude that game actions are also little images of ways of acting and living in the real world. So in this video I want to argue that in order to take life seriously, we must treat it like a video game. Recognize the goal. First of all, in order to recognize life's likeness to a video game, we must recognize that it has a goal. The reason we grind in a video game is because there's a goal we're working toward that requires the repetition of certain actions which move our character toward that goal. And likewise, if we were to grind in real life, and feel a sense of achievement instead of discouragement when our back begins to ache from all the grinding, we must know what goal we are working toward. Now, there are many who have small goals, like quitting smoking, or even slightly larger career-related goals, like becoming a best-selling author or a phlebotomist or whatever else. But that's not the sort of thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about an overarching goal, a meta goal, one goal to rule them all. A goal that objectively assures you that, when all is said and done, you've done what you ought to do. A goal so comprehensive that, when all is accomplished and the credits roll, you'll feel as if it was a life well spent, completed exactly as intended. And of course, this assurance that you've completed the game as designed requires that you know the will of its designer, which itself assumes the knowledge of the designer himself. Some might say that there is no goal, and therefore we need not conclude that there is a goal setter. But I would challenge him to try and live that way, and his inability to live a goalless life will wind up proving me right. It is quite easy to say that there is no God, but entirely impossible to live like it. Atheism can happen in the brain, but it never makes its way to the fingertips. And of course, those who say there is no goal setter might point to the very fact that their atheism never makes it to their fingertips, i.e. that they still nonetheless have a sense of purpose and morality, as evidence against the necessity of believing in a goal setter to have a goal. But that is like a child cheating off another child's math test and winding up with the same grade, then going on to claim that actually knowing how to solve the problems is therefore unnecessary. If there is no goal setter, then there is no goal. If the world was not created by someone with a specific purpose in mind, then there is no specific purpose. Just because you can confess with your mouth that there is no meaning, and then proceed to live as if there is indeed meaning, it doesn't therefore follow that belief in God is no longer necessary to live a moral and meaningful life. It simply means that your worldview cannot seriously account for reality, and you must contradict yourself in order to get by in the world as it really is. So having gotten that nonsense out of the way, step one of treating life seriously, like a video game, is knowing the goal. And that requires reading the instructions. Now, very many of us in the modern age grew up with parents who thought we could just skip the tutorial. Even the religious ones often never truly taught us which button does what, or if they did, they never really told us why, knowing when to press which button would come in handy. So having skipped the tutorial, we've got to pull out the instruction manual ourselves. And this is what it says, quote, "This is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Ecclesiastes 12:13. Or as St. Paul would later put it in his first letter to the Corinthians, quote, "So whether you eat or drink, whatever you do all to the glory of God." The Westminster Shorter Catechism, I think, summarizes the goal setter's instructions quite well. Quote, "Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever." In essence, this means that we are to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. We are to have done all that we have done, not for ourselves or for our own glory, but for the glory of God and the benefit of others. And we are to seek to hear from the Lord when we finish our course. Quote, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." That is the meaning of life. That is how to, quote, have life and have it abundantly. That is the goal of this game of which we found ourselves players. Choose a class. Now, the next step in the process, having realized the goal, is to select our class. Though there is one overarching goal for all players, we are given the freedom to choose from among various builds to fit the playstyle that fits us best, like in an RPG. We need to decide on the particular route we will take as we pursue the broad purpose of our life. I think the easiest way to do this is to choose a particular person, or a set of people, who you believe embodies the best use of your particular interests and skill set toward a highly productive and virtuous end. Learn about their lives, their habits, and especially how they spent their formative years. Note in particular where they allocated all their skill points, and allocate your skill points in the same manner. In other words, imitate the ways in which they got to where they ended up. You may look up at your heroes as if they've ascended to impossible heights, but take a look at the ladder they climbed to get there. It may be the case that you will not be able to climb quite as high as they got, but the goal is not to glorify yourself forever, it is to glorify God forever, and He is glorified by your best, not your ability to match the greatness of others. Yet the benefit of looking to great men of the past is that they demonstrate how much man in general can accomplish by the grace of God. So, for instance, if you haven't noticed in my videos thus far, two of my great heroes are J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Lewis described himself in his inaugural address at Cambridge as one of the few remaining, quote, old Western men. And Tolkien's colleague Clyde Kilby likewise described Tolkien as, quote, an old Western man who was staggered at the present direction of civilization. What they mean by, quote, old Western man is a man who belongs to medieval Christendom, whose values, imagination, affections, and way of life all belong to that past age. What made the, quote, old Western man distinct was his ability to see things in wholes, not just in particulars. He saw the whole forest, not just the individual trees, and this was expressed both in his thinking and in his life's work. As a result, he was not a specialist like the modern man. Today, the average person chooses an extremely narrow field of work or study and dedicates his whole life to that one thing. But the old Western man was a generalist. Because he had the philosophical framework to understand the fundamental unity of all things, he could easily make connections between various fields and become competent in each one. So when you read the Wikipedia page of an old Western man, he is often not known for simply one thing. You'll often find a jurist who was also a scholar of ancient Near Eastern studies, a priest who also wrote children's stories, or a king who was also a composer and poet. It is according to this model that we find people like Tolkien and Lewis, and their fellow Inklings, refusing to stay in their lane. Instead, they made superior contributions as professors, scholars, philosophers, literary critics, and fiction authors. My particular skills and interests are in writing, theology, music, and just creative endeavors in general. So having recognized this, I look to men in history who stewarded similar skills and interests to the best of their abilities, and for the sake of God's glory. I read their biographies, study what they studied, and model my life after theirs in order to imitate, even if rather imperfectly, what they were able to accomplish. So whatever your skills or interests are, find men who are models of each one, who maximize productivity toward a virtuous end, and choose to live your life in imitation of them. This might be men from history or someone in your own life who you look up to. And most importantly of all, find men who model general virtues that apply to all people, and imitate them as well. For the cultivation of your soul is ultimately more important than external accomplishments. As Christ said, quote, for what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? Set objectives. After you've established a life goal and chosen your class based on examples to imitate, the next step is more practical. Set for yourself individual objectives or quests that can act as boxes to check to monitor your productivity as you work toward your goal. A thought experiment presented by economist and theologian Gary North that I found helpful was to imagine yourself being asked to give a speech at your 70th birthday party, or better yet, your 111st birthday party. What are all the things that you'd like to be able to say you've accomplished, which would make that speech something worth listening to? Write down all the things you'd like to say you had done toward the end of your life, and then work backward making particular goals to mark your progress throughout your lifetime. For instance, if you want to be able to say you'd written 15 books, calculate the rate at which you'd have to write them between your present age and when you turn 70, and set a goal to write however many books per decade. Then narrow it down to year, and then narrow it down even further, all the way down to the amount of words you should write every day, starting today. It may seem like your large goals are too much to accomplish, but when you've broken it down to a bunch of tiny objectives, it becomes much more doable. 15 books? That sounds like a lot, but 500 words a day? That's a piece of cake. Again, the models you've chosen to imitate will be helpful in this regard. What are all the things your models accomplished? What steps did they take to get there, and how much time did it take? Take note of these things and set your own goals accordingly. This will not, of course, match up perfectly, especially if they had certain foundations set in their childhood that you must imitate in adulthood. For instance, if you wish to be a classical composer, and choose someone like Bach as a model to imitate, you cannot go back and be taught music theory as a child. You thus have to adjust your personal timeline to gain that knowledge at a later time and in a different way. So be realistic. Do not limit yourself by saying you'll never accomplish what you want, but nonetheless be realistic given the place you are currently at, and set your objectives accordingly. Add achievements. The next step once you've set your objectives is to think of ways to reward yourself for completing them. In a video game, we're motivated toward endless hours of grinding because we anticipate a reward. That reward might be a higher skill level, or a shiny new item, or an achievement for 100% completion. These things give a big hit of dopamine that make our grinding feel satisfying. And the same principle can be applied to productivity in our real lives. A book I would highly recommend in this regard is Atomic Habits by James Clear. In that book, he notes the importance of establishing various kinds of rewards for accomplishing goals. And this can be something as simple as a mere visual representation that reinforces the fact that you're making progress. Clear gives the example of a salesman who would fill a jar with a certain number of paper clips corresponding to the amount of sales calls he wanted to make each day. Every time he'd complete a call, he'd move one paperclip into another jar. Over the course of the day, he'd see the first jar slowly empty and the other jar slowly fill up, until by the end of the day, the second jar was completely full and the other empty. This gave the whole process a feeling of progress rather than feeling like an endless succession of calls. This is similar to the experience points in an RPG. Every time you kill a monster, discover a new location, or craft an item, you see your XP bar fill up more and more, until you eventually level up. By finding visual representations of your progress, whether through a simple checklist or a more creative method like the salesman's jar of paperclips, you can motivate yourself through a continual reminder of the progress that is being made in all your small successes. And as these small successes build up into the completion of larger goals, you can give yourself set rewards for those bigger wins. This can be as simple as rewarding yourself with ice cream or a new video game. But it is especially helpful, as is often done in video games, if your reward is something that helps you accomplish the very task you've made progress with. In video games, for instance, you might be rewarded for killing monsters with a more powerful sword that will make you even better at killing monsters. Thus, if you're an artist, for example, you might decide that once you've completed X amount of paintings, you'll buy yourself a new set of brushes or whatever else you would buy yourself. I don't make paintings. Or if you're a game developer, you might say that once you've finished this or that tedious element in your game, you'll buy yourself marvelous design to make designing clothing for your characters easier. These sorts of relevant rewards are not only motivation to accomplish the goal that is necessary to receive them, but they also motivate you to keep being productive after you receive them, since you'll be excited to use them. It's basically like establishing a gameplay loop, but for real-life productivity. Have fun. Lastly, it's necessary that, as you are productive, you focus on enjoying the process. It can be easy for a person focused on productivity to always have future goals in sight, and miss out on the experiences that are happening around him. As is stated in the Westminster Shorter Catechism passage quoted earlier, the chief end of man is not only to glorify God, but also to enjoy Him forever. We do not merely exist for utilitarian ends. We exist to enjoy things, first and foremost to enjoy God, but secondarily to glorify Him by enjoying the gift of life and the world He has created. As I noted in my video, A Philosophy of Games, We enjoy games because humans are made to find satisfaction in the process of structured progress toward a goal. And that is ultimately what life is. It is sometimes pointed out that we quite humorously have fun doing tasks in games that we find no joy in doing in real life. For instance, Rockstar games frequently have you doing mundane activities like mowing grass, towing cars, driving a taxi, going to the gym, chopping firewood, feeding animals, taking a bath, and so forth. People even play simulation games entirely devoted to these sorts of things, such as Power Wash Simulator. This proves that whether we find mundane tasks boring or enjoyable entirely depends on our perspective. When we establish ahead of time certain goals, tangible reminders of our productivity, and rewards for our efforts, this frees us up to live in the moment and enjoy our tinkering away at small tasks. It establishes a structure for our efforts so that we can observe the larger significance of our many mundane tasks, causing us to see that they are actually not so mundane after all. We often look back with fondness upon periods of time which we took for granted or even dreaded while we were living them, because we hadn't yet arrived at the place we wanted to be. This change in perspective is because we're able to see the bigger picture when looking backward, of which we are often ignorant while in the moment. The tedious tasks of life are the means by which we grow personally, make contributions to the world, and, possibly most importantly, relate to other people. We form relationships and create memories with others through the most simple of activities, and we often long to go back to a time when we worked at a certain job, or were in a certain class, or engaged in a certain hobby, not necessarily because the task was that significant, but rather because it created a meaningful experience that we shared with others. So don't fail to enjoy the numerous small tasks that you spend your days on, because that's what life consists of. And life is a gift, which we are given only once to be enjoyed, and then it's game over. If you recognize the goal and spend your life joyfully working toward it, giving thanks for every moment along the way, then you will come to the rolling credits not full of regret, but rather satisfaction. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Please like and subscribe and all that.